we're going to have Charles Clough, who give a paper on about interpreting end-time geophysical catastrophes. And last year he gave a paper, if you recall, on the presuppositions involved in this type of interpretation, 3 major presuppositions that many people aren't even aware of. This year he's going to actually deal with some text, specific text, follow up with it. And Charles Clough was a guy that really influenced me when I was in college. Started listening to his tapes when he was a pastor at Lubbock Bible Church. And he pastored there for 12 years. But previously he had graduated from MIT in, I think, earth science, mathematics, meteorology, or something like that. And he then got a master's at Texas Tech in meteorology and worked for the government, the U.S. Army, as a meteorologist. And so he has both biblical training and skills as well as a practicing scientist, so to speak, in the field of climatology and meteorology. And so he's going to come and talk about that particular subject, about how past catastrophes may or may not interpret or impact what God's going to do in the future. And also, I want him to, if he will, say a few words about global warming and the controversy that's going on, because he's testified before legislatures and stuff like that, against man-made global warming and things. And also, that famous MIT professor is somebody he had at MIT in that area as well. So if you'll come at this time, Charlie, and clean up any misrepresentations I gave of you or whatever. Thank you.
Okay, Tommy. Thank you, Tommy. Well, as you know, this week we have things going on in Europe, Copenhagen, and all I can say is that as a result of many months of arguing these cases, I've come to the conclusion that someone pointed this out to me, by the way, last week, that toward the end of his presidency, Dwight D. Eisenhower gave a famous address. And we often hear the address made in referencing the dangers of the military-industrial complex. And what Eisenhower meant by that was where you have a large defense industry that is funded nearly 100% by the government, that their vested interest isn't necessarily helping the soldier in the field. Their vested interest is profits for their corporation. And what I did not know about Eisenhower's speech was he also warned about a second point, and that was federally funded laboratories. And his point was the same thing, where you have scientific laboratories whose lifeblood is 99% coming out of government funding, and put yourself in that place. If you were the head of a laboratory employing 800 people and 100% of your budget was coming out of the federal budget, what would you be doing? And if you can answer that question, you understand my commentary. The issue here is basically a momentum that has been built up by certain laboratories in our nation, and the momentum is interlocked with the political intrigue. And from our point of view as Bible-believing Christians and dispensational premillennialists, this is a very dangerous development, because this could well be the final push to attain global government, because climate change by definition is global. And by definition, if you really think that man can do something about it, it's got to be a global thing to do. And the United Nations bureaucracy has been looking for years to get some excuse for its existence outside of just aid to the poor countries. And this is a magnificent opportunity for the UN bureaucracy. So they're hungering and thirsting after global sovereignty. And this is a beautiful play for them. And you can pray that this would be thwarted. I personally am not convinced that the hacking that you read about last week in the laboratory in England, I don't think that was hacking. I think that was an insider that was basically dumping. And that's good, because that's an answer to prayer. Okay, let's look at the paper today. This is Interpreting Text and End Time. And by way of introduction, Robbie dealt in the past paper with details, fine details of differences that exist within our premillennial dispensational camp toward the book of Revelation. What I'm going to do is a larger scale. As Tommy said, last time I dealt with some of the presuppositions that are involved in hermeneutics. I'm going to develop those a little bit more, and I'm going to approach my whole approach here is trying to show a line of reasoning that modern language theory uses increasingly. It's not the kind of reasoning that we're used to in our camp, but I've learned from some of the college students I work with trying to understand how they are being taught in today's classroom, that today's classroom has shifted from what it was 20 or 30 years ago. Today, everything is culture, race, postmillennialism, and particularly in the area of language, how language and meaning are constructed by your social milieu. In other words, what group you belong to controls your vocabulary and controls your thinking. So I want to see if we can take that argument, because this is going to be the future argument. That's the shape of things to come. So what I want to do is I want to piggyback that kind of argument and show that we can justify our hermeneutic using their approach with biblical presuppositions. So in the introduction, I have a quote, and the quote is from what I think is going to be an increasing competitor to us, and that is the full preterists. For years we've had preteritism, but more recently we've had the full preterists. And the full preterists are actually far more consistent than the partial preterists, because the position they're taking in the book of Revelation, which is largely symbolic, now they're taking that to Genesis, so that at both ends of the Bible we have the same hermeneutic. And they're challenging us that we're saying what our position is not that of what a normal Israelite reader of the Scriptures would have taken as the meaning. So that quote says, these two methods, young earth futurist literalism, so we're combining what goes on in Genesis with what goes on in Revelation, and the full preterist hermeneutics play strongly in modern debate over both Genesis and biblical prophecy. Then he, to characterize our position, he says, a dogmatic literalism fosters interpretation that would have been completely foreign to the original writers of biblical passages. Literalism yields a global flood in Genesis as well as global interpretation of New Testament prophecy. The modern hermeneutic, myopia, screams for a cure. Erroneous exposition at both ends of the Scripture embarrasses modern Christians of all persuasions. So that's the kind of the viewpoint of becoming a well-published group. These people are experts at publishing their positions. So in my introduction, I mentioned that passage like Matthew 24:29, where it talks about immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken, and so forth. That's the kind of text that they look upon as sort of a code for social and political events. And I mentioned in my previous paper the hermeneutical contamination from three sources. And I think there are three sources here, and they are serious contaminations. And in the scholarly literature, I'm not sure that people who are writing in the academic community are fully sensitive of these things. Well, the first one is modern cosmology, which uses the term science in a deceptive manner to appropriate for itself the credibility of laboratory science. And that's a fundamental difference. Laboratory science, you can reproduce things, but when you deal with past history, you are much in the form of a jury in a trial. It's a forensic thing, trying to reconstruct something that you can't directly measure. And then I covered in the previous paper the anthropocentric epistemology. And this comes out of the Enlightenment, and this has a lethal chunk, a lethal idea in it, and it undermines a hermeneutic. And I'll show you later where it even undermines evangelical analysis of the text. And that is that information contained in linguistic expressions arise solely out of man's mind. Whenever you have a thought, that has come out of man's mind. This perspective starts out by completely repudiating the two kinds of being, the creator-creature distinction. And the final analysis is that it forces the exegete and the hermeneutic to operate on Hebrew imaginative autobiography. That's what it becomes. The whole Bible is just a Hebrew autobiography, if you accept that. The third influence was the effect of recent language theories, all of which operate inside that kind of epistemology. Meaning, according to this approach, is constructed by whatever sociolinguistic community harbored the speaker or the writer. And that's why in the college campuses today we have so much talk about culture, about race, about gender. It's about everything that separates us. Don't ever talk about anything that unites us, like we're all made in God's image. Let's talk about everything that separates us, and then wonder why we have a fragmented society. The problem here is that whatever the construction dynamics are, the resulting meaning is arbitrary and merely conventional. With such a low voice of language, the interpreter cannot accept that Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek text carries the bandwidth of information from the mind of God to the mind of man. Now, after all, when all is said and done, whatever our interpretation of the passage is, we're talking about revelation. Has God of the universe spoken in human history, or hasn't he? If he has, then the Word of God trumps all human speculation. If we're not going to treat that, then just deny the fact that God has ever spoken in history. There's only two sides to this debate. Finally, in cleaning up our hermeneutic, I concluded with 5 things in the paper, and I won't go through reading the whole thing here, but number 1, interpretation must contextualize, to use the modern buzzword, contextualize such passages within the community of writing prophets. And I think that sentence underlined the word writing prophets, because we're not arguing that the meaning that Jesus or the apostles or the prophets expected us to get from the words was the meaning that would have been taken by the average Israelite who might be in apostasy. We're talking about the shaper of the language of meaning is the community of the writing prophets, not necessarily Israel at large, because Israel at large oftentimes was apostate. 2, interpretation must recognize the cultural impact of early historical prototypes of future geophysical judgments. Events such as the fall, the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, and especially the Exodus and conquest events prepared the language of end-time prophecy. Finally, interpretation must observe the spectrum of localized geophysical phenomena affecting Israel that's implicit in the Sinaitic covenant. And 4, the idea that history is not a dead end, it's going somewhere with a consummation. And 5, numerical patterns of cosmic judgments, the sevenfold seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, do not have to be artificial symmetry of literary structure. So we want to go into that, and the first part of the substance of my paper is this next section, the relation of man and nature. All the judgments in the Bible that purport to speak of judgments on nature, and that's what we're talking about here primarily, involve how man is related to nature. So if we're going to understand the meaning, we might go back into Israel's history and think, how would I think if I were a member of the writing community and I heard these words? I would be someone who had a memory of these events. I would have a cultural context of Mosaic cosmology, and I would have inherited Moses' writings. The writers have a cultural context from Moses, and they had 2 major ideas, actually a third one that I'll go through. Here are the 3 basic ideas. 1, the idea of theocentricity. This was unique to Israel. It wasn't true of the pagan world. And so when we interpret the literature and we talk about genre, and we say this is a genre that's common to Israel and outside of Israel, just a minute. Whoa. How can you say that quickly? Because you've got to deal with the fact that one of those communities was theocentric and the other one wasn't. So we have to be careful of what we talk about when we talk about common genre. Paganism is fundamentally nature-centric. Ancient Near Eastern origin myths conceived of a continuum of being shared by deities, sky, earth, man, and animals. In Enuma Elish, for example, there's a transmutation between the material cosmos and the goddess Tiamat. Man later emerges out of that prior matrix. Similar elements occur in modern cosmology. Man is a casual result of cosmic alchemy, whereby non-living matter spontaneously somehow transmutes into a sequence of living entities. That's not new. Darwin didn't invent that. That's just classical paganism. From Genesis onward, biblical writers incessantly affirm God as creator of all. Then we come to the second idea, and this is very important today, dealing with the environment. I mean, here we are. It's the big theme of our time. And it's amazing to me that we can sit here and talk about geophysical judgments of the Bible and never once think about, wait a minute, what's the biblical view of man and nature? So let's look at it. Dominion man. Paganism fosters the idea that man is slave to the gods and goddesses, which in turn are temporarily varying and capricious features of nature. In such servitude, man knows only anxiety and fear of tomorrow. Now that's political manipulation going on right today. It's the same thing. In utter contrast, Genesis 1 and 2 pictures man as Lord of his earthly environment. This is not a popular idea today. He lives in subordination not to nature, but to nature's God. In Genesis 2, God provides a model of what dominion looks like. He plants a garden. That means that nature is not complete until it is managed in such a fashion as to bring forth its full fruitfulness. The romantic notion of pristine nature untouched by man, and a lot of the modern ecology work to talk about preservation. It's not conservation like it used to be 50 years ago. The buzzword is preservation. Now, those two words do not mean the same thing. Two radically different approaches. The pagan romantic notion of pristine nature untouched by man is a delusion. The measure of man is thus the zone of his dominion or his kingdom. This dominion ideal is not the selfish anthropocentricity that modern ecologists accuse the Bible of fostering. It was to be disciplined by the effect of theocentricity, responsibility to God. And I have a big long footnote on there in which I refer to a good work. I might point out that there's a book coming out within the next week that you want to be aware of. It's called Nazi Oaks. It's called The Sacrificial Offering of the Judeo-Christian Worldview in the Holocaust. This man is a pastor in Washington. I've encouraged him over the years to develop his essays into a book length, and he's spent years doing this. Basically, the argument is that we have in the Third Reich an historical exhibit of what happens when an entire national policy is constructed out of its hatred for the dominion. And he shows you the documents that lead to this. In Europe, you had Schopenhauer. In America, we had David Henry Thoreau at Walden Pond. And we have these people that have inculcated the literature, the liberal arts curriculum. People think that's great. And when the Nazis came in, we not forget they had organic gardens outside of Auschwitz. The Nazis argued that they had to destroy, for example, Poland and the other areas because they were afraid of those industrial areas being dangerous to the environment, and that we wanted to turn the Ukraine, for example, into a garden and forest. The Nazis said this. It's very clear. And so their hatred for the Jews arose out of their hatred for the dominion teaching of the Jewish scripture, something that people haven't seen too carefully. Then the third idea that we find in the Bible and in Israel's history, not only is there one God over all, not only does man have dominion and is given a role over nature, but then we have an integrated nature, the terrestrial, the extraterrestrial, the visible, and the invisible. Biblical writers were well aware of the sun, moon, and stars as integrated with growth in the fields of wheat, barley, and orchards. As, after all, an agrarian society can't avoid the connection between the sun's elevation and the seasons, nor could a society that was required to maintain exact calendar dates for their feasts ignore celestial bodies' positions and motions. And I go into that. I mean, it was 200 years before the New Testament that Jewish people had been, they had inherited the observations of the Babylonians and the Persians, who developed quadratic equations to forecast celestial events. These people aren't stupid. They have calculators. I was going to bring a PowerPoint slide of one of the tables where they solved differential equations for star motion using tables, because they didn't have graphs, but they had it all solved. So this is the background of our people that wrote the New Testament and the idea of what they were thinking. Now, hermeneutical consequences for interpreting these catastrophe texts. First, idea number 2 defines man's zone of responsibility. I think that's something we need to think about when we think of a geophysical judgment. A geophysical judgment on what? What's the zone of responsibility? What's the target of the judgment? Dominion establishes the dimensions of existence for which individuals, cities, and nations are held accountable to God. A city like Sodom, for example, had a domain that included men, women, and children, the sociological dimension. But that's not all. It also included fields and products of trade. That is the geophysical dimension. Its economic health was supported by natural processes. A further aspect of the geophysical dimension that we don't think about oftentimes of a pagan domain, like that of pre-exilic Israel, was their astral pantheon. Remember when they looked out on the stars, the sun, and the moon, they're looking on their pantheon. They're worshiping these things, Deuteronomy chapter 4. So if we're going to judge them and we're going to judge their theology, I think God judges the astral, the heavens, to disrupt their worship of those very heavenly elements. So idea number 1 added to 2 establishes the zone of judgment and recreation. In other words, man becomes responsible for those zones of responsibility. And then you add idea number 3, and that is that biblical writers who thought in these terms would feel quite at home intermixing terminology referencing the natural environment as well as the angelic and demonic agents acting upon the natural environment. I mean, the whole pseudepigraphical book of First Enoch is talking about the stars as living beings. So there's not our distinction between the material universe totally separate from the spiritual. They didn't think that way. They brought the two together. That is bound to affect us. Now the section summary that I have for this first part of the paper, we talked about man and nature. The relationship of man to his natural environment in the world of the Bible is structurally distinct from paganism as to 1, its theocentricity. God is the creator. He's the one and the definer of dominion. 2, its subjection of nature to judgments against man. Now, this is interesting. Today in the ecology, the idea is we trash the environment. And even evangelicals are picking up statements out of the prophets and saying, see those statements in the Old Testament about you defile the land. But if you look in the context, they're not talking about wrecking the land by throwing Coke bottles and junk. The defiling of the land was because they were idolaters. It was their religion that defiled their land, and it defiled their land because God had to judge their land because of their false religion. So the attack on nature was an indirect one. It came about because God had to clash with their idolatry. Then he judged nature. And its comprehensive picture of man, nature, and the background angelic powers operating as an integrated system. Now this could be embarrassing, but I want to show you a little slide here to remind us of the extraterrestrial connection. That event that you see there happened on March 13th, I believe. No, that was in December, 2 years ago. NASA goes satellite X-ray imager, shows a massive flare on the sun. And take an idea how big that sun is, and just look at that explosion that's happening on the left side of the slide. Many, many times bigger than our planet. Now, this is the seething political environment, the physical environment in which we live. And that slide ought to remind us that back in September 1st of 1859, the first time a flare was actually seen is called the Carrington event. This happened on the 1st. It was happening in the evening of September 1st, 1859. A British astronomer was looking out and he saw a flash. And by the morning, you could read your newspaper at 4 a.m. from the aurora as far as south as the Caribbean and Hawaii. The whole Earth was affected within hours by this flare, and in fact, telegraph operators were shocked. Paper burned up because they have long telegraph lines. People have estimated that if we have another flare like this in our time, it would knock out probably all 900 satellites. This is our vulnerability. You can't look at the Earth, like so many people do, as some sort of a little airtight compartment that's totally disconnected from the rest of the universe. So when you see geophysical judgments in the Bible, it makes sense. If God is going to judge the Earth, he's going to involve extraterrestrial sources. Shouldn't be a problem with modern readers. Second part of the paper is the experienced geophysical judgments against Gentile dominion. And I'm just going to review some of history of Israel. This is the history that colored that community's ideas of what meaning they should attribute to words like earthquake, like smoke, like fire. They had that shared history, and we have to keep their shared history in mind. The prototype of all judgments was Eden. Think about Eden. What do we have there? We have an anatomical transformation of the serpent's body in verse 14. We have an altered future history of a satanic interaction with man in verse 15. So now we're dealing with the invisible agents behind the physical universe. We have a physiological and altered feminine dynamic in marriage and family structures in verse 16. And we have a comprehensive judgment on the male from a cursed ground that yields botanically mutated plants, physiological deterioration, and physical death. So we have all of this in the first judgment. Note that the Edenic curse was dimensionally commensurate with Adam's dominion. It went as far as to alter crucial components in the natural environment. The material bodies of Adam and his wife experienced irreversible changes that could be empirically observed. Zoological changes occurred, again, which could be observed. It's interesting that both the preterists, in the way they view Revelation and the way they are now coupling themselves with the old earth people in Genesis, they have to do it, and as I say in the footnote 11, how do they explain cruelty in nature? And their best answer is, it's just a revelation of God's dangerous and wild character. Then the second great event that they shared was the flood. And the flood, we're not going to argue, that's been argued for years, that it was a global flood. It's not somebody's bathtub overflowed in the Euphrates River. The ark, if it had, would have drifted downstream, not upstream. So I don't think we have to beat that horse. But the point is that that was a tremendous event that happened, and forever afterwards, it's interesting in the Bible, there's a fear and an anxiety in the Bible about God's control of the sea. There's a fear of this, and I suggest to you that fear and anxiety came out of the memory of the flood. Then we have the trial of Job. It's the same kind of pattern. The approximate causative agents against Job were both natural phenomena and humans, yet both were part of an invisible satanic causation. Furthermore, his final deliverance involved, again, both geophysical and human spheres. So you have the whole thing is put together. Then we have the Sodom and Gomorrah judgment. God's destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was recent to the time of the writing of the Scriptures. And it was recent enough and nearby enough, it's only miles down the road, it was recent and nearby enough to be recalled again and again by the writing prophets of Israel, Jesus, and the New Testament. Although these cities could be taken out by human means, just normal human military activity, Genesis 14 an example, God chose to do it through a geophysical catastrophe in chapter 19. With these cities sitting on the great rift between Asia and Africa that runs northward from the Red Sea through the Jordan Valley, one can speculate that God used both tectonic and atmospheric or extraterrestrial agencies. You look at the slide I have here. Back in 2005, in Ethiopia, which is south of this area, we had this crack develop. Now that is from very high altitude. So I'm going to take another slide, and you'll see what it looks like on the ground. Next slide. That crack turned out to be 35 miles long. It was up to 20 feet wide, and it happened in a matter of hours. And what it is the Asian plate separating from the Middle Eastern Arabic plate. The tectonic plates are separating, and they separated within hours. So this is the kind of terrain that the Bible people lived in. And the point is that people living and seeing this sort of thing are going to think in literal terms. Okay, next we have the Exodus complex of judgments. And everybody agrees that the Exodus was a fundamental thing in Jewish memory. It was experienced, it was remembered. And I mentioned the fact that there's an increasing tendency, even in our evangelical camp, to say that, well, the Exodus event only represents the religious meaning. What it was just a mundane thing that happened, and they thought about it, and they said, we think there's a deeper meaning to this thing. And so it's the religious ideas that come out of whatever caused the Exodus. Well, let's think about that. Let's think about what went on in the Exodus. And we have a chart there where I just showed something that's sort of like the literary patterns you see in the book of Revelation, where people who have studied the Exodus narrative point out there are 3 cycles to those judgments. Now, what's interesting is that because people see that there's this numerical order, it's like it has to be due to the fact that whoever composed the narrative made up that from the more chaotic real situations. So the order, the highly ordered numerical structure, is purely a literary invention. It's not what happened. Like, God can't possibly show numerical order when he exercises his sovereign power in the historical events. Now, let's look at those events themselves. Blood-colored waters lasted for exactly 7 days. The frog infestation reduced to only the Nile. Lice spread over all Egypt. The flies completely avoided all the Hebrew area of Goshen because God said, I will make a difference between my people and your people. The pestilence upon the cattle was timed exactly and excluded from Israel's livestock. The boils began with Moses' hand motions. Hail of a unique type occurred at a specific time with fire mingled in that was so very heavy there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation, and yet it failed in Goshen. An east wind brought locusts, which neither your fathers nor your fathers' fathers have seen since the day they were upon the earth to this day. At Moses' intercession, a strong sea wind blew every last one of them back into the Red Sea. Finally, a strange 3-day darkness occurred, except in Hebrew dwellings. Then the ultimate judgment came upon only the firstborn, not in homes with blood on the door. Add to these plagues the Red Sea crossing with a dried seabed, and walls of water on both sides of the opening, which suddenly destroyed the Egyptian chariot force. Does this text consider such phenomena mundane and ordinary? Their unique magnitude, exact timing, and discrimination in spatial occurrence are all explicitly stated. Yes, there are secondary causes, but they're controlled. With the textual notices of time and spatial precision, why should interpreters doubt that the sequential pattern, in the figure we showed you before, must be due to a humanly contrived literary organization? By attributing this order to human literary ingenuity, like the liberals do, or even a Holy Spirit-inspired ingenuity, like evangelical commentators sometimes do, such a hermeneutic diminishes the revelation inherent in the plagues themselves. Let me repeat that. If you're attributing the order and the numerical design of the plagues to a literary reanalysis of what went on, then you're subtracting the revelatory impact of the original plagues. Now, why is that important? Because they were designed to glorify Yahweh to a pagan, Pharaoh. This hermeneutic would imply that Pharaoh would have to wait until the Hebrew rearranged their story to get the first message. Certainly important to the matter of hermeneutics is the narrative poetic renditions of the Red Sea crossing in Exodus 14 and 15. Here we got a test case. Exodus 14 is prose, Exodus 15 is poetry. Now, if you compare the two texts, do you see where in the Exodus 15 and the psalm and the poetry Are they exaggerating what went on in chapter 14? No, there's not a trace of it. True, there can be found elsewhere in the accounts Rahab and the dragon and Leviathan used for Egypt, but those images reveal the prophet's understanding of the demonic forces involved. Even the narrative does this because the first two plagues are counterfeited by the Egyptian magicians. So there's an awareness in their culture that behind physical phenomena are angelic intermediaries. So when we come to the book of Revelation, we read about the angel and the sun. That's something that John just didn't think about. That's something that's embedded in their whole cultural understanding of geophysical phenomena. I conclude this judgment event by stating again that the dimension of a judgment matches the dimension of the domain judged. In this case, Egypt's entire kingdom was affected: the people, the economy, the military, and last but not least, the magician priests of the Egyptian pagan religious establishment. Their religion relied on an idolatrous interpretation of the Nile, an idolatrous interpretation of animals, an idolatrous interpretation of the sun. Look at Egyptian art. Sun is one of the big things. So what did God do? Turned it off. Go ahead. You want to worship him? You better tell him to turn his switch on. You see where it's colliding with the very fabric of their cosmology. Each part of the pagan perspective has to be, what maybe I should say in modern literary terms, deconstructed. Geophysical catastrophes have a higher purpose than providing symbols for cryptic political messages. They are to devastate astral idolatry with physical manifestations of the supreme glory of God. And we have further history, the conquest events from Jericho to Hezekiah. In the interest of time, I won't go through every one of them, but there's just a sequence that were well known. And by the way, all these events that I'm talking about so far are directed not to Israel. They're directed to the enemies of Israel. Notice, the enemies of Israel. They're against the people before the flood. They are against Pharaoh. They are going to be in the conquest events against Israel's enemies. For example, second paragraph I have the pre-invasion intelligence mission discovered how the Exodus event had already shown Canaanite pagans that Yahweh was God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Just like in Revelation 6, they're going to know that these judgments are of God. In the same way they did. How did Rahab know this? She wasn't reading the text, I don't think, of the book of Exodus to get the literary structure of the plagues in order to conclude that something happened down there and we're scared. They didn't have to have the story rearranged by Hebrew literati to get the message. By far, the long day of Joshua stands out as a prime example of God's miraculous intervention with nature. Sun and moon stopped in their transit across the sky. Commentators have made numerous attempts to dismiss the clearly unique characteristics of this event. Biblical writers, however, and this is an important point because people often accuse those of us in the young earth creationist camp, those of us who are in the dispensational camp, when we look at this, they're accusing us of arguing that we're making the Bible a textbook of science. Now that canard is ridiculous. Here's what we're really doing. We're saying that, look, here these people are. They're not scientists. They're simply people that saw this stuff happening and they're reporting it. You could say they're layman observations of what went on in the nature around them. We're not making the Bible into a textbook here. We're simply saying that the narrative literature has layman's observations, and so we can think and say that's information we need to try to reconstruct what happened. And those people aren't biased. They don't have a theory. They're not geologists. They're not astronomers in the modern sense of the word, but they observe this. And they observed it very carefully, as Joshua 10 points out in the commentary. There has been no day like that before or after it. You don't have to be an astronomer to say that. That is a statement based on their life, in their history, in their time. There was another conquest-related judgment occurred during the time of the Judges. Judges 4 and 5 offer the interpreter prose and poetic accounts of the same event like Exodus 14 and 15. The prose narratives reports that Yahweh, and the emphasis there in the Hebrew is Yahweh, not Barak, routed Sisera's chariot force. And you might ask, wait a minute, how did Yahweh rout the force? You could sloppily say, well, they had a lot of people down there and they just... Infantry doesn't rout a chariot force. That was the whole point. That's the point about the Exodus. That's infantry going against tanks. So how did that happen? All the narrative says it's Yahweh that routed the force. But then, in the Song of Deborah in chapter 5, by the way, the narrative also says that somehow, during his retreat, Sisera abandoned his high-speed chariot and fled on foot. Now, what does that tell you about his chariot? You don't, if you're fleeing from somebody, you don't get out of your car and hitchhike. Something happened to the car. So what the narrative omits, the poetic Song of Deborah supplies. After first citing the geophysical disturbances that accompanied Israel's earlier march, in her song she reverts back to the Sinai experience of the nation because she's part of the nation. The song recounts how the stars fought against Sisera in concert with a flooding storm. Evidently, much in the same way the Egyptian chariots were mired in the Red Sea, Sisera's chariot force was mired in the Kishon River Valley. Hardly a location that normally floods. That's precisely the point. It hardly floods. Yes, and when it did flood, they said, "Duh, this is unusual." You don't want to diminish the observations that these folks are giving us in Scripture. The Kishon location reminds us of the famous Elijah confrontation with the state religion of Baalism. Now we've got a pagan religion taking over Israel. So now what do we do with the dominion judgment issue? Well, now what's the dominion? The dominion is the state of Israel now, right? Because now it's involved officially in the state religion. That's the Baalists were sort of the ACLU of their time. So we have the Mount Carmel occurrence of Yahweh's fire from heaven is only part of an entire campaign against Baalism by Elijah and Elisha. In Leah Brana's book, a real good study of the Elisha cycle, she says this: prior to the unearthing of the Rashamar tablets, it was never recognized that these wondrous narratives were intentional and planned attacks to demolish the very foundations of pagan mythology. They are the work by a well-informed author who was intimately acquainted with Canaanite mythology and protested against it by showing that all powers in heaven and earth are under control of Israel's God. The miracles discharged by Elijah as increasing the oil and meal, withholding or releasing the forces of rain, restoring the dead to life, ascending into heaven, were designed to undermine the belief prevalent in Canaanite circles that Baal was the dispenser of those blessings. And then we could could mention Hezekiah's sundial incident, which is the next paragraph in the paper. So, section summary. Modern language theory that is increasingly shaping evangelical hermeneutics makes much of the sociolinguistic community dynamics that's said to construct meanings in the community's language. This section has shown that the sociolinguistic community in which the Bible writers lived had significant memories of how and why God had actually interacted with man through the visible and invisible parts of nature. These remembered experiences particularly reveal the supremacy of Yahweh over Gentile kingdoms and paganized Israel institutions. We can infer that the prophets of cosmological signs and wonders would expect their readers to view geophysical catastrophes as directly observable polemical revelation. They may well have used catastrophic imagery secondarily to preach the glory of God, such as 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18. But such imagery had real, full-scale prototypes. Now we come to a third section of the paper, and I'll go through this reasonably fast here because of time. The nature, judgments, and the redemption of Israel. Now we come to judgments now not focused on Israel's enemies, but focused on Israel. Now we're involving ourselves in the fine print of the Sinaitic covenant, Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26. And Alvin McLean years ago put it well when he pointed out something. When you look at the history of Israel, you want to remember something that makes Israel's history different from all other history, all other nations. And it's this: the well-being of men, not only physically but every other way, is morally and spiritually conditioned by a principle confirmed by divinely imposed sanctions. Now, this principle holds good generally in all nations in every age, but its operation has often been obscured to human eyes by the time lag. Take this country, for example. The time lag between the moral breach and the infliction of the sanction. In the general history of nations, the divine penalties are inflicted through secondary causes behind the veil of providential control. But in the case of Israel, the moral judgment of Jehovah was not only declared at Sinai, but was confirmed spectacularly in the recorded history of that kingdom by divine sanctions. As a result of that, Israel became a national exhibit A, testifying to the existence of a moral order in the cosmos before the rest of the nations. And I have a footnote there. It's an interesting point of history. And nobody really has addressed this. It's amazing. I've taken philosophy courses, and they always say, gee, something happened in the 6th and 7th century, because all of a sudden we have 6 religions develop all around the world. Confucius in China, we have the Vedanta Hinduism, we have Buddha, we have Zoroastrianism in Persia, we have kind of a Judaism that develops, and then we have, for some reason, philosophy develops, boom, just like that in Greece. Now, how do you explain that? Every one of those movements emphasized one thing: rationality. Confucius could care less whether God exists, but he was rational in his hermeneutic. His idea of an ethic, there had to be an ethical cause. Where do you suppose in the 6th and 7th century the entire set of civilizations got this idea from? I suggest that the Bible has the answer: the diaspora. The Jewish people took the scriptures with them, and they spread the memory of that special history of their nation that taught them, you screw up and you get a judgment. And that gave an ethical birth to a rational environment. In other words, there's a reason behind what happens. Israel's domain of responsibility, of course, is the local land. It was defined in Leviticus 26:28 in the context of the Sinaitic covenant. Then we have something else going on in the history of Israel that I think merits a discussion about, particularly when we think of the return of our Lord. The environmental violence of theophany. From the beginning, Israel experienced Yahweh in theophanies that caused physical violence. The encounter with God at Mount Sinai and the subsequent wanderings left a distinct impression in the culture. Yahweh demanded what Eugene Merrill has called sacred space. He demanded it in Eden. He demanded it in Sinai. He demanded it around the ark. He demanded it in the temple. When Yahweh therefore establishes such a space in a theophany, there can be a violent disturbance in man's fallen physical environment. Thick clouds, smoke, fire, loud noises of a trumpet or of thunder, powerful earth tremors happened at Mount Sinai. Only authorized people were allowed into the zone under threat of lethal force. Not even animals could enter. Compare it even to Genesis 3. The same violence attended the pillar theophany at the Exodus and during the wilderness, which is later blended with literature in the Sinai violence. Later prophets longed for such a theophany to make Yahweh's name known. Such environmental violence, however, is not to be interpreted in modern terms as natural cloud, smoke, fire, noise, or earthquake. The Bible insists that these apparently natural phenomena were mediated by angelic beings from the invisible world. The Bible says that over and over. Psalm 104 links angelic beings to wind and fire. David actually saw the angel that threatened a plague on Jerusalem. In his visions, John the Apostle reports seeing angelic controllers over the physical environment, including the sun. Nature, it must be remembered, in the culture of Israel had visible and invisible parts. Physical stars in the ancient world were thought to be living creatures. It should not surprise us, therefore, that the violent phenomena accompanying a theophany is viewed by biblical writers as either caused by principalities and powers, angelic beings, or transmutations of those otherwise invisible agents. The linkage of environmental violence in Israel's early encounters with Yahweh theophanies may explain the thunderstorm earthquake language throughout the Bible. Consider the expression rider of the clouds, rider of the wind, rider of the heavens. Some interpreters consider such an expression to refer to an ordinary thunderstorm in the same sense as Ugaritic mythology speaks of Baal. However, in the context of these passages, there's a theophanic type somewhere in the background. Just look in the context when that thing comes up in the text. And then I say that frequent mention in these so-called thunderstorm passages of accompanying earthquakes challenges the interpretation that these are ordinary thunderstorms. Ordinary thunderstorms don't cause earthquakes. And yet the two are united in these passages in the Bible. The storm imagery was derived not from ordinary thunderstorms, but it was derived from Israel's historic encounters with God's judgment, both against Gentile powers and the theophanies that accompanied Israel's birth. Then we have a section here. Again, I think I can go through this pretty quickly. The violence bound by contract. And that is the wonder of the Bible, that unlike Islam, that says Allah could never enter into a covenant in which he has obligations to man, because that would somehow decrease his deity. It would ruin Allah if he agreed to anything with us lowly creatures. But that's what the Bible says. That's the wonder of the Scriptures, that the God who has this tremendous violent showing up, that the violence is tailored and he curtails his violence, as it were, by what he's agreed to do and so on. He's a God who's entered into a covenant, into agreements with us. Tremendous theology of that. So the cosmos was seen to have a moral order, but only because all-powerful Yahweh made and kept covenant. Pagans had no such conception. The cosmos was unknowable and capricious. To control the geophysical environment of Jesus' domain, Yahweh's covenant implied total control over even the invisible part of nature. Then we have Israel's redemption. The idea for God to redeem Israel, he would have to redeem the whole responsible dominion of Israel. Not only would the people have to be redeemed, but so would the nation's cities, the soil, the crops, the herds, the climate, since all bore the brunt of judgments under the Sinaitic covenant. For such a redemption to take place, Israel must nationally, of course, fulfill the ethical requirements of Yahweh, and that's the story of the new covenant. Jeremiah would have expected his readers to understand that when the new covenant promises changes to nature, he intends them to be interpreted literally. Agricultural prosperity is vital to any economy. References to crop and herb production mean just that. Defanged animals are needed for herd and for safety. Light level is a major driver of botanical growth. Amillennial interpretation, here's where premillennialism comes into its own, I think. Amillennial interpretation restricts redemption to the spiritual sphere. It ignores the symbiotic relationship between man and nature under God. We've got a fundamental problem here. Amillennialism doesn't come to grips with a biblical view of man and nature as a coherent, interacting group. Postmillennialism does a better job, at least in acknowledging that nature must be included in any concept of redemption. But it too is restrictive in that it ignores or minimizes the invisible part of nature, the background of principalities and powers that are going on, and the struggle in that area. Only the much maligned premillennial interpretation school reads prophetic texts with the same general perspective as the writers. Now we come to Jesus. He was part of Israel's history after all. The incarnation confirmed this perspective as the Son of Man whose coming was prophesied in Daniel 7. Jesus takes upon him the original dominion role given to Adam. But in this dominion role, explicitly enlarges to include all of nature, both terrestrial, extraterrestrial, visible, and invisible. That a violent theophany didn't accompany the incarnation is because God had become man for a test period under a canonic condition. But nevertheless, there are flashes of his deity, such as what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane in John 18, that the movie that, what's-his-name missed at the very beginning of his movie. What was it? The Passion. In that scene, it opens up in the Garden of Gethsemane and see all that fog around. You know what he should have done in the beginning? Is have that one incident from the Gospel of John where the army's coming up, the police are coming up, and he says, "I am." Boom, and they go down. Then the movie, with all his physical suffering, you'd say, gee, all he has to say is quit it, and it would have stopped. See, what a powerful thing. And he totally missed it, absolutely missed that flashing forth of Jesus' deity. Of particular interest is the Mount of Transfiguration. Note the catastrophic physical instantaneous changes. Radiance of the face comparable to the sun. We read that? If you were sitting there and you as a layman are describing that his face turned into a light like the sun, you'd have your sunglasses on. This isn't some little thing, gee, he turned white. This is a brilliant light that happened. How do we explain that one? Transformation of his clothes. A bright cloud over the mountaintop. God the Father speaks. You could have recorded it. DVR. Manifestation of two dead leaders out of the invisible word of the dead. This is the nature that we live in. It's not the world of the modern reader. When Jesus instructed the disciples in the language of Old Testament prophets in the Olivet Discourse, he expected them to understand it as people living with the Old Testament view of nature as symbiotic with man, not symbolic. Parallels with the apocalypses of Isaiah and Jeremiah would be recognized. I quote this verse, and I have it out there in the italics. Look at this quote from Zechariah. And this is what these people are thinking about. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, and in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. It shall be split in two from east to west, making a very large valley. Half the mountain shall move toward the north, half of it to the south. Then you'll flee through my mountain valley, for the mountain valley shall reach to Azel. Yes, and now look at this last clause. Yes, you shall flee as you fled the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Now, is he using past history or not to load the meaning of his prophecies of future? And you can read about that. Amos was an earthquake forecaster. He told all about this earthquake 2 years in advance. You know, he didn't have a seismic graph. And geez, I'm looking down here to see what's going on. It's God told him what was going to happen because it was a judgment. And then finally, Jesus' resurrection is one of the greatest events in human history. We need to think about the resurrection when we get challenged. I challenge young people to do this. When they get all screwed up and wrapped around the axle, just think for a few minutes. Just turn off the text messaging, shut off the radio, turn off the TV, and just think for 5 minutes about the implications of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Look, what does it say? In an instant of time, a material body is created that has genuine flesh and bones. It consumes food. It speaks with a vocal intonation of a previous existence. So Miriam in the garden, who's confused about who this thing is, who this person is, suddenly all he has to say is Miriam, and he must have had a favorite way of expressing himself to that lady. She recognized immediately his voice. He had the voice of his previous body. He has features of his previous body. He appears and he disappears. He ascends into heaven. It invalidates every modern conception of man. DNA, we say, is the place where our biological features are encoded. Wrong. That does not explain the resurrection. How does the information from our bodies today, after they're blown up, burned, buried, and all of a sudden it reappears in a resurrection body? I guarantee you, the information didn't get transferred through the DNA. What was the transfer? We don't know. But it challenges a conception that's at everybody. Oh, yeah, it's just DNA. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. As Pilkey said so well, the resurrection, whenever it is conceived as a metaphysical reality and not just a liberal image, it annihilates every premise and every conclusion of Marxist, Freudian, and Darwinian schools of thought. It erases the premise of Marxism by positing a version of humanity independent of the natural food chain. It cancels the premise of Freudianism by furnishing a degree of vitality so absolute that temporary sexual euphoria loses all meaning. And it destroys the whole point of evolution by bringing mankind to perfection in an instant of time. And Ladd's point about it's actually the first installment on the new universe. So we have a summary then of this section. And that is that, let me go on here, 18, because of our time. The New Testament writers had additional experiences with special geophysical events beyond that of their Old Testament predecessors. And we've gone through and shown you about that. So let's go to a conclusion. Using the prophets and apostles' cultural context. See, that's the game today. We've got to interpret everything in the cultural context. But that's why I constructed the paper the way I did. I did go through the cultural context. So using the prophets and apostles' cultural context to interpret end-time geophysical judgments. Well, we have some warnings there. No one can understand the interplay between man and the visible and invisible without a self-conscious attempt to set aside modern notions. We also have to self-critically evaluate how information originates in man's minds. Here's something. Watch it when you read commentaries. Watch this one. This is how sneaky it gets. We self-critically evaluate how information content originates in writers' minds. We'll fall into the trap of ignoring prophetic visions as the true sources of information. It's far too easy to imagine that the Apostle John had some sort of mystical encounter and then wrote the book of Revelation from a collage of Old Testament texts that he knew. Any similarities between Revelation and, say, Ezekiel are then explained as sourced in Ezekiel rather than in John's vision. Instead, the similarities might be, revolutionary suggestion, the fact that he and Ezekiel saw the same thing. In other words, the reality is in what they saw, not on borrowing literally from each other. Finally, unless we respect the historical line of revelatory events uniquely experienced by Israel, we'll fail to recognize the nuances in vocabulary and phrases. And I make some comments here. I want to conclude with this last thing. Let's take one of the most difficult texts geophysically, Matthew 24:29. What about the stars falling? In sharing with his disciples a common cosmology and body of historical experiences, how would Jesus have expected them to understand his words? He had just spoken of famines, pestilences, and earthquakes, all familiar elements in their historical horizon. These words would recall memories of Egypt in Joseph's day, the plagues of the Exodus in Moses' day, the tectonic disturbances of the Sinai theophany, the great earthquake of Isaiah's day. All were actual geophysical history. All were under the absolute control of God. Jesus also spoke of social and political turmoil, including prophesied desecration of the temple. He spoke of demonically inspired signs and wonders. Surely those words would have brought to mind the role of invisible world in energizing deceptive happenings. Then Jesus spoke of his coming. And from Daniel 7, the disciples would have associated the coming of the Son of Man with the very presence of God. This coming of the Son of Man from the throne of God could not help but make them sense the likelihood of environmental violence that accompanied God's appearance at Sinai in the wilderness. Sure enough, the next thing Jesus speaks of is degradation of the extraterrestrial environment. The sun, the moon, and the stars, in the view of Jesus and the disciples, were universal time standard for calendar making, agricultural planning, whose regularity was contingent upon God. They were indispensable for maritime trade. Think about navigation. How do you suppose they navigated in the Mediterranean without a sense of celestial navigation? Didn't have GPS. To claim that they would functionally fail meant that all the kingdoms that all the nations had constructed would be severely affected. To functionally disrupt the astral lights would not only devastate national economies, it would undercut religious idolatry. Disciples could recall how plagues discredited Egyptian pantheon. They could remember Joshua's long day and the Canaanite solar worship, Elijah and Elisha's miracles to destroy Baalism. And now we come down to, and by the way, we could say that if Revelation were to happen just the way we were talking about this morning, right now, today, it would be a refutation of the idea that this universe is some placid thing that takes 1,000,000 years to build a mountain out of a molehill. Because all of a sudden we'd see, no, these are high-power processes, and we know very well who's the cause, Revelation 6. But what of the phrase, the stars will fall from heaven? Here we face the writer's perspective in which the invisible powers and principalities are somehow connected to the observed heavenly lights. Jesus could well be including a struggle involving angels that are connected with actual stars. That may be true, but it doesn't get into the mind of Jesus or the early prophets about what exactly they saw in their visions of falling stars. So we go, in most of the prophecies, sun, moon, and stars are considered together. Three things together. Genesis does it, and in Isaiah and Joel, when you think of the day of the Lord, they all have their lights put out. We could infer that the picture observed by the prophets was one in which catastrophes on earth, and this is just a conjecture, would generate smoke debris that block an earthbound observer from seeing any of them. That would mean that the coming of the Son of Man involves only the earth and doesn't really affect extraterrestrial regions. But that inference is only something we moderns add to the text. To understand why the stars in Jesus' discourse are seen not as being darkened but as falling, we might obtain help from revelation given to Isaiah, in which he had seen all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, all their hosts shall fall down as leaf falls from the vine. The Hebrew word nabal usually translates fall down, can mean wither, as the NET Bible translates it. The metaphor of leaves falling depicts the result of the leaves first withering before disappearing from the vine. It does not necessarily include the resultant falling. The LXX translates it by the Greek word pipto, the usual meaning of which is fall. And Jesus uses that verb in his comment. However, if the LXX sense is that the stars simply disappear from the sky as leaves disappear when they fall, then withering is a possible explanation for Isaiah's vision, and the NET translation is given. This translation reunites the change in the stars with changes in the sun and moon. That is, all the prophets saw basically the same thing in their visions, a darkening of the sky reminiscent of the plague of darkness in Egypt during one of the great judgments on the Gentile nations. This understanding of Jesus' Olivet Discourse, again, allows us to infer that it may be terrestrial only, but that's an addition we make. Finally, to sum up, the disciples would have understood Jesus' words as descriptive of the real heavens, just as they would have understood his earlier remarks referencing real geophysical catastrophes on Earth. And that's it. I guess we have some time for some questions.